Hey Wargamers, Games Workshop recently released the Grotmas detachment for Tau, and that is the auxiliary detachment. So today we're going to talk about what that is, break it down step by step, and how you might want to use it in your army. So basically, the auxiliary detachment, which isn't particularly creatively named, is a detachment that focuses on the interaction between your Tau forces and your auxiliary forces being Kroot and Vespid. So it isn't the Grotmas detachment I was expecting. I was expecting something focused much more on stealth or the infiltration cadre type detachment, but this makes a lot of sense based on the models that we've gotten recently, right? We've gotten a lot of Kroot redone, we've gotten brand new Vespid models, so of course it makes sense. Games Workshop is going to try to cater to that new model line and give something that gives a little bit more explicit support to those new models. So that's why we have the auxiliary detachment. It's very cool, very thematic. Basically, the idea here is that you're going to use your Tau to protect your Kroot and Vespid. Basically giving you access to some forms of board control, a little bit more of a delivery system for some of these short-ranged or melee-focused units that otherwise are going to be a little bit more vulnerable, especially because neither Vespid nor Kroot are particularly durable on their own. Having the ability to protect them a little bit more makes them much more reliable. And then on the flip side, you have Kroot and Vespid that can protect and also buff your Tau. So this is going to force your opponent to get really close to you and allow you the opportunity to kind of spring a trap on them with your short range or melee units that otherwise maybe would have a hard time getting to where they need to go. So that's a strength of the detachment on its own right there. Plus, you get some pretty solid benefits to your shooting in the forms of -1 AP and some other bigger benefits like +2 to strength through things like stratagems for your Tau units. So you really do have this interplay where the Tau help the Kroot and the Vespid and the Kroot help the Tau, which is a really cool thing that's been missing from Tau gameplay for this whole edition, right? There really hasn't been this interaction between the two. Generally, the auxiliary troops are just add-ons, tack-on pieces that you use as auxiliaries, but they don't really feel like they're a cohesive part of the army. That changes in this detachment, which is a really cool gameplay mechanic, a really cool way that Games Workshop has made these more interactive components of the army, which is cool. One thing that does pop out to me about this detachment as a whole, though, is it's one more thing that you have to keep track of in terms of positioning, right? So we'll get into this with the rules, but basically for this to work, you have to have your Kroot and your Vespid in close proximity to your Tau units, and so you have to make sure that the positioning works on that. And that's, one more thing that you have to keep in mind. One more thing that, on paper is not an issue, but in the, real-time gameplay can become more challenging. And so it's one more thing to keep track of, and especially given the complexity of running a Tau army already with observer and guided unit dynamics. This is just one more thing, like, oh well, I have my observer, I have my guided unit, I also have my Kroot unit there. You just have it takes a lot of thought. So it is a more complicated way of playing. So overall, I'm really excited about this. Let's take a look at what the actual detachment rules are. All right, so the detachment rule is integrated command structure. And really, the way this works is that it gives your Tau units one rule and it gives your auxiliary units another rule, and those rules benefit the other group. So the Tau units get a rule called localized stealth projectors. And basically it says that if there is a Kroot or a Vespid unit that's wholly within 6 inches and visible to that Tau unit, that Kroot or Vespid unit has lone op, right? It can't be targeted unless the unit is within 18 inches. So that's an extremely powerful rule. That makes a really big difference. It means basically they're not going to get targeted unless they're close. But in order to benefit from this, the Kroot or the Vespid has to be fully within 6 inches of your Tau unit, which is pretty darn close. And so that can offer some challenges for larger units, especially unless you wrap them around your Tau unit. So, you might have like a 20-man unit of Kroot and, a 3-man crisis suit unit, you'd have to really wrap that Kroot unit around the crisis suit unit, and that can lead to some herky-jerky movements and things like that. So that can be a little awkward, a little challenging to actually do, especially when you start to consider things like terrain or other units, right? But it is possible, and can have some benefits too, right? If you're wrapping a unit, they are not going to be able to be charged, for example. So that is one nice thing. But if we're looking at this more practically, things like Hounds, Vespid, those are probably going to be really good buddies. If we think about this as a buddy system, they're going to be good units to consider for this because they are smaller bases and smaller units. So you're able to fit them within 6 inches more easily. And so you're going to have a little bit easier time doing this. Plus, Hounds and Vespid are pretty quick, and so they can keep up with some of our more mobile Tau units like Battle Suits. So you have a lot of options there. You might also think about something like Rampagers, larger base size, but again, they have some speed to them, and they are an effective deterrent for enemies getting close, right? If you keep your Rampagers next to kind of a more valuable shooting unit, those Rampagers are going to be a deterrent, saying, hey, if you have to close the gap, if you need to get close to me, you're going to put yourself at risk of getting charged by these pretty nasty, angry gorillas. And the cool thing is you can't shoot them, right? There's no way to deal with the Rampagers unless they get close. So you have to you force your opponent to make a decision there, and that's when you can exploit that decision to your advantage. Alternatively, you can use this rule to deliver those Rampagers to a target, right? So you can put them next to a unit. Maybe it's stealth suits, right? Maybe it's a ghost kill. You can put those Rampagers next to a unit and move them up to where they need to be, and have them actually get to their target as opposed to being shot off the board right away. So this rule alone makes auxiliary units much more viable, and it gives you some really nice options, both in terms of offensive but also defensive gameplay. Looking at the alternative, or the opposite, right? The other half of this equation is targeting triangulation. And this is the rule that Kroot and Vespid themselves get that benefits Tau. And so what this does is says that if an enemy unit is within 9 inches and visible to your Kroot or Vespid unit, a Tau Empire model other than Kroot or Vespid, i.e. just normal Tau, improve the AP value of their shooting attacks by 1. So that is pretty awesome, right? Just +1 AP or -1 AP, however you want to frame that, for a unit that's shooting at something that is close to and can be seen by an auxiliary unit. That makes a huge difference. And so if you think about having those Vespid units drop down in the back line, have a bunch of Kroot Hounds run up and get up close to a battle line, you're going to get -1 AP against a whole lot of units just for having an auxiliary unit basically on the board. And that's a huge benefit that you don't have to do a lot to achieve. And so there's really highly generalized value here. You're going to be able to benefit from this in almost any matchup that isn't something where you're relying strictly on invulnerable saves from your opponent. So you're really going to get a lot of mileage out of this, and it is much easier to achieve than localized stealth projectors, right? You just have to have that Kroot or Vespid unit on the board and close to your opponent. You don't have to worry about keeping things within 6 inches. And so the targeting triangulation benefit is going to be something that's a lot easier, a lot smoother for you to maintain. But it does require you to have, these components in your army. And so one thing that you might want to consider is, doing things like rushing Kroot Hounds up turn 1 into the front lines of your opponents so that you can get that extra AP bonus. They're small, cheap units. They're fast. You're not going to necessarily mind if they end up eating it after that first turn. But if you have a few of these units built into your list, you're going to get a lot of value out of it. And so both of these rules are really valuable. They offer a lot of generalized value, nothing that's necessarily super flashy, and it's just like, oh man, this thing is totally broken just looking at it. But it's more subtle, more widespread and more generalized, and oftentimes those types of benefits are the ones that really make for stronger lists. So oftentimes this type of more subtle, consistent benefit is better than a more limited, punchy, showy benefit. And I think that's what this is. And I think we have an opportunity to really do some cool stuff using these rules, especially when we get into the enhancements and stratagems. Okay, so our first enhancement is Student of Kao Yun. Basically, if you have a Recruit Shaper, you can give them this enhancement for 15 points, and during the Declare Battle Formation step of the game, you can select 3 Carnivore or Farstalker units and say, hey, you guys have Deep Strike now. And that's pretty cool, right? Like, having Deep Strike and Recruit, nice. It's almost a nod to like the Crude Hawk idea that we've had from decades ago at this point. But yeah, Deep Strike and Recruit, awesome, right? What's not to like? For 15 points, you know, we probably can work that into a list, right? And so you could put this on, you know, a big unit of carnivores, so a 20-man unit of carnivores, and that's going to give you some really interesting options for board control and for screening. If you put it on a small unit of Croods, you're going to have some nice deep strike potential for getting that AP buff. Even if they're not necessarily going to be able to do that much on their own, you're able to put them down on the board at a place where you're going to be able to guarantee having the AP buff next turn, right? Because you have to be within 9 inches in order to get that AP buff. But if you put a small unit down, you know, they can move and give you the benefit. You could use like Rapid Ingress, for example, to make that work in a more reasonable timeline, right? And so both of these for either big or small units of crew can do some really interesting things, but either way, you're going to have sticky objectives if you're putting carnivores down. And so that can be a nice way to mess with your opponent, you know, deep strike your crew carnivores down, have them sticky objective, run around, you know, do some screening, do some board control, give you an AP buff, right? It's a win-win situation. You have a lot of utility there. However, you're probably not going to get your maximum value out of this, right? Like the more we invest in Groot, the less we're investing in things that are going to be doing more work, right? And so you're unlikely to have, you know, like 3 20-man units of carnivores that you're going to be deep striking or something like that, right? You're probably going to have a smaller proportion of your army comprised by those units. And so, you know, 2 units probably seems more reasonable than 3. You're probably going to want to take carnivores over farstalkers just because of the sticky objectives and, you know, frankly, the economics, the point efficiency of carnivores over farstalkers. So yeah, you're probably not going to get as much as you possibly could out of this, but that doesn't mean it's not worth taking, right? Still, even if you're deep striking 2 units of Groot, that gives you some really nice play options. The other enhancement that we have that works for Groot is Fanatical Convert. And again, this is a Groot only. The previous enhancement was for Shapers only. This is a little bit more general. You could put it on any Groot character model. So like a Lone Spear, for example, also counts here. But the Bearers unit has For the Greater Good, which is important for 2 reasons. One, if you had a big unit and you wanted to improve their shooting, you could do that. But more importantly, it allows them to be observers. And if they're observers, then you have some nice, you know, redundancy. Some more observers is always a good thing, basically, right? So having an observer in your army that's a Groot can be really useful. And so it's a simple effect, cheap. It's 10 points. You know, almost auto include, especially in this army. If you're putting it on a Shaper, you could potentially stack this with the previous enhancement in a 20-man unit, because 20-man units can take 2 leaders, so you could have 2 different Shapers in your 20-man unit and get, you know, both of those things for that unit, which is cool, right? You could have, you know, a unit that one unlocks Deep Strike for 3 Groot units, but then also you have For the Greater Good for that big 20-man blob, and so you're potentially able to increase their shooting in a way that's really efficient, which is good. But the alternative is putting on a Lone Spear, like I said, and putting on a Lone Spear might make more sense. Basically, you know, for 10 points, you're bumping up the cost of the Lone Spear, basically not for the benefit of, you know, the +1 ballistic skill, but instead for them being an observer. And because they have Lone Op naturally, right, it's in their stat line, they're going to be a really good observer. They're going to be hard to dislodge, and so that gives you some nice benefits. they're really mobile, and so you're going to have line of sight to the things that you want to have line of sight to. And of course, they give the benefits to Kroot that they give in terms of rerolls. So having a lone spear in your army is going to be a really advantageous thing in this type of list, and so giving them fanatical comfort just ups the value even more. And so I think that's probably the way that you're going to want to play this. There's just so much value packed into that fanatical convert lone spear that you're going to want to take that. And they generally don't need to be guided, right? Like they're good enough that they're going to be able to perform on their own, and it would kind of be a waste to guide them, other than a scenario where you don't have anything better to guide. So, right, I think this works out. I think it makes a lot of sense, and this is probably another auto include in your army in terms of enhancements. All right, shifting over to enhancements that are taken by Tau units instead of Kroot or Vespid units. I mean, there's not any enhancements that are taken by Vespid, but you get the point, right? These are Tau enhancements. We have Admired Leader. Basically, it has two parts to it. You give it to a Tau model. In your command phase, you can select a Kroot or Vespid unit within 12 inches of that model, and it gives them +1 leadership and +1 OC, assuming they're not battle shocked, right? And yeah, both of those can be pretty darn good. For the improved leadership benefit, that's going to be really useful in that 6 to 12 inch range, where they're not getting lone op from being within range of a Tau unit, but they are still within range of this benefit. So that 6 to 12 inch range is really where you're going to get the most use out of this, because that's where they're going to be vulnerable to shooting but still being able to be affected by this enhancement. And for smaller units, you're probably not going to get as much value out of this, because they're either going to be on the board or they're going to be dead. You're not going to have as much opportunity for them to be at 25% starting strength or something like that. But for larger units, like a 20-man unit of Kroot, right, you're going to get a lot more out of this, because they're going to have a little bit more staying power and much more likely to be in this kind of degraded state where leadership comes into play and you have to take battle shock tests. So improved leadership, nice, great. But really, I think the star of this enhancement is the +1 OC, right? That can make a difference in a game, right? It pairs well with our other enhancements, the ones that we just talked about, as well as the next one that we're going to talk about, as well as some of the stratagems. So you have a lot of utility just kind of baked into this. It's a synergistic thing. It makes a big difference for things like hounds, right? Hounds on their own have no OC, but if they're within range of a Kroot character, they get +1 OC. So now they're at 1, and you could pile this on top for 2 OC. If a unit of 5 hounds run around, they could make a difference. They can grab objectives, hold them a little bit here using this, which is nice. Other things like carnivores, right? If you have a big unit of carnivores +1 OC, that can make a difference on your objective control, and objective control is the name of the game. So that could be a game winner if it's employed in the correct place, right? If you have a unit of 20 Kroot and you give them +1 OC, that's 20 additional OC on an objective that is going to be hard to dislodge. So this is something that could make a big difference. And of course, once Kroot carnivores have an objective, they have sticky objectives, they will continue to control it as well. So that makes a difference. Really, you'd want to put this on a Kroot, or excuse me, on a Tau character that's going to be nearby your auxiliaries, but also able to keep up with them and be where it needs to be, right? So something like a Cold Star in a Sunforged unit seems appealing, because they're going to want to end up being close, where those auxiliaries are going to be in order to give you the AP benefit. They're going to want to be at that same kind of range, and so having this Cold Star unit have the Admired Leader benefit allows you to do some cool bullying for objectives, right? Like you have this unit of Sunforge unit up there. They're going to take care of one thing. You can have your hounds or your rampagers or something else that's kind of trailing alongside them. They break off. They grab a different objective. They do something else. And you give them this benefit, and suddenly you have kind of a multifaceted thing, as opposed to just the one unit of crisis suits that's trying to do its thing in isolation. So it gives you a little bit more interaction here, which is, again, the name of this detachment. That's the point of this detachment. And I think this is something that does exemplify that play style very well. Is it worth 20 points? Probably depends. If you have the 20 points, maybe throw it in here. But it is situational. But I think it's a solid investment if you are building your army around with intent of using this, right? If you're not building your army with intent of using it, it's probably not going to be very useful. But if you are intentional about incorporating units where this is going to be a useful thing, then you'll be well set. All right, and the last enhancement we have is Transponder Lock Module. This again goes on a Tau Empire unit. It is on a walker that can deep strike, so basically that's going to be a commander. And it's probably an auto include, right? It has some really nice benefits to it. Basically, it can allow you to deep strike on turn 1 using your auxiliaries as homing beacons, right? So regardless of where your Kroot or your Vespid are, they can your Tau unit can deep strike within 12 inches of that unit, as long as they are 9 inches away from enemy unit. Right, so you still have to keep that 9-inch distance, but being able to drop in within 12 of a Kroot and Vespid means you have really good options for board placement on turn 1, regardless of the mission rules. And so this really does allow Tau to alpha strike, deep strike better than retaliation cadre now after the changes to how deep striking works. So if you didn't know, in the last update, basically Games Workshop said, hey, it's too much to allow you to deep strike within, outside of 3. Now it has to be outside of 6, and so you're really not getting as much benefit in Rec Cadre as you could with a deep strike. This is almost a better version of that now. So having this in a unit of Sunforge again seems like a really easy play. Put this on a commander in a Sunforge unit, have them deep strike next to some auxiliaries and get their detachment benefits. Going to be great, right? So it seems like a really useful thing. Plus, you have the commander up in the unit or up close to your auxiliary units, and afterward you're able to give them their lone operative benefit once you're next to them. So it just seems like a win-win and something that you're really going to want to take advantage of. All right, so let's take a look at some of the stratagems here. Starting with experimental modifications, it's 1 CP. In fact, all these stratagems are 1 CP, which is pretty nice and also really important because you're probably going to want to use as many of them as possible. So having it be 1 CP is good. Experimental modifications is in your shooting or fight phase. You select one Kroot or Vespid unit that hasn't fought yet, and they get -1 AP, or they get 1 AP better, right? So that's good, right? That basically switches the detachment benefit over to the Kroot and Vespid as opposed to only affecting Tau, which is, again, great. But it's probably going to be situational because it's just not going to compete very well for CP with some of these other stratagems. One place where you might want to use it is something like on Rampagers, right? Going to -2 AP on their strength 6 hits is going to be a nice thing, considering they're probably going to be targeting things that you're going to want that AP for, right? So that's pretty solid. Giving 1 AP to other things, even a big unit of carnivores, that's going to be good. But boosting a Vespid unit with their AP is going to be useful at times as well. But because it's only one unit, because it's only 1 tick of AP, it's probably not going to compete extremely well for your CP. Another stratagem is multisensory scanning. This happens at the same time, shooting or fight phase. You pick one Tau Empire unit, so it could be either Tau or it could be auxiliaries that hasn't fought yet. And basically, if you pick a Tau unit, you reroll wounds of 1. If it is a auxiliary unit, you get full rerolls to wound. And so rerolling ones to wound for non-auxiliary units is probably going to be redundant if they're guided by stealth suits, right? So stealth suits guiding gives you that reroll 1 to wound on its own, so you won't need to use this again for those units. But if you lose your stealth suits, this gives you an option to do that, right? And there are certainly cases where having that rerolls to 1 has saved my butt. So I'm not going to say you're not going to want to do that. But for your Cruider Vespid units, giving them full rerolls to wound is awesome, right? Like you're gonna have your lone spear on the board. That's gonna give you rerolls, but this gives you another way to get more rerolls, which is great. And so big Vespid, big crew units, crew docks, all those things are things that you're gonna want to target this with in a way that is gonna really amplify their damage output. And so this is something, again, you're probably going to want to use, but isn't necessarily in the top 2 slots yet. Next, we have Pheromone Waypoints. This is something you use in your movement phase. You target a Cruider Vespid unit that hasn't moved yet. They get an auto advance 6 inches, right? That's a really solid benefit. Movement is one of the most important things in the game, and so having your 6-inch movement here or 6-inch advance here is going to be really useful. You're probably going to use this quite frequently. And it allows you to keep your auxiliary units near your Tau units so they can maintain that lone op, right? Even if you have a unit of crisis suits or a unit of piranhas or something like that that's moving really fast, you can use this to help them keep up and keep their lone objective status or lone operative status, right? And so that's really good. Also, you could use this to have them break out, grab objectives. Also is going to pair well with some of these other stratagems that allow for a unit to advance and charge or advance and shoot, right? So you are going to get some nice benefits out of this. And finally, it's going to allow you to launch your auxiliary forward in order to have them be kind of this AP buff missile, right? So if you have a unit of Crude Hounds and you want them to be able to really get up to the front lines there, you pop this stratagem, they'll get their auto advance, and they'll be able to affect a much larger portion of the opponent's army in a way that maybe they wouldn't have if they rolled a 1 to their advance roll. So alien expertise. This is, again, in your movement phase. Here you can pick any unit, any Tau Empire unit, so Tau or auxiliary, but the effect is different, right? So until the end of the turn, your unit is eligible to shoot in a turn in which it advanced. If it's a Cruider Vespid, they can declare charge in a turn in which it advanced as well. So this is what we were talking about with being able to stack these two together. If you have a unit of Rampagers, let's say, you advance them, boom, pop alien expertise. Now they can charge as well. You're getting some nice benefits there. And so, yeah, this is almost always going to be useful. Stacks very well with the waypoint stratagem and can allow for some really aggressive movement outside Mon-Ka for both Tau and auxiliary units, right? If you're able to move and shoot, which is one of the main benefits of Mon-Ka, you're able to you're able to be in the place you need to be and shoot the things you need to shoot. So for Tau units, this is good. For auxiliary units, this is better because they can also charge, which, especially if we're looking at things like Rampagers, that's going to be one of their, if not their only, real function. So, so it allows them to kind of hang out in this lone op bubble, right, where they can't be shot. And then as soon as that opponent is close enough, they can move, advance, and charge, and you have suddenly this huge threat range by stacking these stratagems together that's going to really affect not only the opponent's choices, but your ability to capture objectives, remove units. So alien expertise is, again, one of those things that's going to be really competitive for your CP. Rounding out our stratagems here, we have Guided Fire. This takes place in your shooting phase. You pick one Tau Empire unit that's not Cruider Vespid, so it can't be an auxiliary unit. And until the end of the phase, you add 1 to the strength of their shooting attacks. If they're within 9 inches of an auxiliary unit, though, you add 2 to the strength characteristic, which is transformative, right? Plus 2 strength, plus the -1 AP from potentially from the target being within 9 of the auxiliary unit, right? +2 strength, -1 AP for any weapon is meaningful, right? That turns a strength 5 pulse rifle into a strength 7 -1 AP, just pain in the butt, right? Any weapon is going to be in a much better position with this, and so really, the places that you're going to want to use this the most are your high volume of fire places, because you're going to be making a proportionally much larger difference there. But even in your low volume of fireplaces, like if we're looking at an ion accelerator, right, only 6 shots, that's going to cross some really important thresholds depending on your target. So you're going to want to use this as much as you can. This is going to be one of your top choices for CP usage, and basically any unit in your army is going to benefit from this in some way, right? Because +2 strength, -1 AP for any weapon is good. But if we're looking at things like breachers, crisis suits, even riptides with heavy burst cannons, right? Those things get kind of wild once we start putting +2 strength, -1 AP on those. And so this provides a really strong incentive to have lots of buddies on the board, lots of auxiliary units on the board, in order to make sure that those units, both your shooting units, are going to be within 9 inches of an auxiliary, but also that the target is going to be within 9 inches of the auxiliary, or you're going to want to have to move your whole army as one. So you're going to want to use this as much as possible, whether you're doing that by having multiple auxiliary units on the board, that are allowing you to claim the maximum benefit here, or just having your units kind of close together. You're going to be using this all the time. Interlocking maneuvers. This is at the end of the fight phase. You pick one Tower Empire unit from your army that was eligible to fight. If that unit was not within engagement range, it can make a normal move up to 6 inches. Otherwise, you can make a fallback move. Right? And so if it's within combat, you can fall back. If it's not in combat, you can make a normal move. Extra movement, always good, right? Like this is arguably better than like retro thrusters, or whatever they're calling it now. Again, I can't. What is it? The Torch Star maneuver, something like that. Right? Like this is awesome because it allows you to fall back from combat, and you do it in any fight phase. It's not just your fight phase, it could be your opponent's fight phase too. And so you could fall back after being charged, and then your next turn you can act completely normally, right? You didn't fall back in that turn, you fell back in your opponent's turn. So you can fall back, and then look, your next turn you're able to do whatever the heck you want, which is probably going to be shoot. And that is extremely powerful. So interlocking maneuvers, if you need it for the extra movement, use it. Right? You could, if I had to pick between advancing auto 6 and getting a second movement, I'm going to do second movement, right? Assuming that I don't absolutely need that advance, in the phase in order to achieve an objective, or get in range of shooting or something like that, right? This is something that if you have to pick between those two, just take your chance on the dice roll, use interlocking maneuvers, get your extra movement, and you're going to be able to have even more movement, more board control than you would otherwise. So this is great in that case, but especially in the case where you can fall back on your opponent's turn, this is fantastic. Use this early, use this often. Guided fire, interlocking maneuvers, definitely the top 2 picks here in terms of your stratagem usage, right? And because, all of these are good, but I think these are the best. And so in a environment where you're going to be pretty CP limited, I think these are the things you're going to be looking to use almost every turn. All right, so overall, I think this is a really solid detachment. It's subtle, but I think it has a lot of play in it. It's not a lot of big flashy parts, right? It's not like the one thing that somebody looks at and says, oh no, this is going to just totally ruin my day. This is totally overpowered, right? That's not what this detachment is. It has a lot of more continual benefits, a lot of more benefits that are opportunistic, things that you can use as you need them. And I think it's going to provide for a really interesting style of play for both you as the Tau player and your opponent, right? That just seems like a really fun way to play, and also a really effective way to play. Of course, the drawback here is that it requires both Tau and auxiliary units to be effective. So if you remove one of those pieces of the puzzle, the whole thing kind of starts to fall apart. And so there is a limitation here. There is a context dependency here that can be exploited by your opponent, which is part of the reason why I think it's an interesting, engaging detachment to play, is that it gives you a lot of options, but also gives your opponent some options. As far as actual gameplay goes, of course, as we've been talking about, it's going to be a very CP hungry detachment. So bringing Ethereal or Farsight is going to be really useful. Having Farsight in your list, being able to reduce the cost of a stratagem by 1, that makes it one of these stratagems free for you, which can be really good. Having Ethereal there to get your CP, also going to be really good. More generalized but less reliable source of CP. So Farsight probably is the way that I would go, but not necessarily, especially because Farsight is a lot of the case that we've been talking about using CP in conjunction with things like crisis units. So Farsight in a crisis unit gives you that option here, right? So that's good. But Ethereal unit giving you access to that CP on its own means that you're able to spend the CP on your other units that aren't crisis suits more effectively. So, pick one, depending on your army composition, I suppose. You're going to build your list around partners, right? You're going to have some strategy in. You're going to have some strategy, right? You're going to have some strategy based around who you want to be working together, right? Are you going to want hounds with piranhas? Are you going to want rampagers with riptides? Are you going to want Vespid with crisis suits? What are your pairs? What are your partners here, right? Figure that out and then go from there, right? But you're going to want those auxiliary units, of course. You're going to want your punchy Tau units, of course. Right? Even strike teams can be effective here. We talked about how having strength 7 -1 shots, potentially 30 of those if you're close enough. That's going to make a dent in a lot of things. So even strike teams here have more play here than I think most other lists. Maybe Manka, right? Because you can get the lethal hits there that can make a difference. The question here, though, of course, is does it pay off, right? Is the inclusion of your auxiliary units access to these benefits? Is it making up for the generally lower efficacy of those auxiliary units at the surface, right? So, you're kind of diluting your army a little bit by betting on these interactions, by betting on these interactions between your Tau and your auxiliary units. Would you be better off just taking your Tau units in something like Manka or Kaoyan, right? Would one of those other detachments just be better? And that's something that probably will depend on you and depend on your play environment. But as a whole, I think that this is a really solid detachment. I think that it's probably one of the more exciting ways to play Tau right now, and one of the ways that's going to give you a lot of options that maybe take some time to get used to. It's a different way of thinking about the army, certainly from, basically for a long time, right? For years, if not decades at this point. We really haven't seen a list that really focuses this much on the interplay between Tau and auxiliaries before. And so it does take a perspective change, I think, in order to effectively generalize. So overall, I think it could be really good. You just have to change your mindset a little bit about how these units work. So let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, love to have a conversation about it. And as always, happy wargaming. Watching. If you stuck around to this point in the video, maybe you want to join our Discord community as well. There's a link in the description below. Special thanks to all my supporters over on Patreon, but especially the folks that you see on your screen now. If you want to help make more invasive wargaming videos, consider joining our community over there as well.